So go ahead.
No worries. All right, yeah. So I want to ask, just like, what were your first thoughts when you saw the announcement? Was this insane, crazy marketing stunt?
Yeah, not so much insane, because it's not the first one, right? Like, so we've had since 2014 this campaign to run under 2 hours using so-called expert science. So I got a press release from a colleague or a friend of mine who said, "What do I make of this? It looks like they're going to try and not game the system, but play as loose as possible with current regulations in order to get this done." Which since 2014 was always my feeling is how it would be done quickly. I remember in 2014 when I read about the Sub-2 project, which was obviously the preceding one, saying that the only way they'll do this is if they run it downhill with giant fans blowing the athletes along from behind.
Yeah.
So when I read this press release that Nike had put out, and then subsequently the article that you carried and a few others, I thought, well, that's where this is heading, So it's not necessarily insane, because I think it might be doable if you are willing to bend the regulations in order to change the physiological demand,
Okay. What do you think would be the most likely or successful way in doing that? You briefly mentioned this on Twitter, I know.
Yeah, so when I first saw it, I thought, okay, they're going to run them downhill, point to point, where there's a likelihood of a tailwind. So you'll remember, and many of your readers will remember, in Boston in 2000 and whenever, I can't remember what year it was, but they ran a 2:03, and that was thanks to a tailwind, and that was 3 to 4 minutes faster than Boston would normally be given the other conditions. So that was a good example of what a tailwind can do if it's strong enough and in the right direction. So that was the first thought, and then the downhill. But then as the day went on, I started to think, maybe based on a little bit that I was hearing from people, that the more likely way to do it would be the shoe, and that they're going to try and put something in the product that makes the shoe more elastic / stiff. I mean, you can go into what those concepts mean, but basically to make the energy cost of running lower using shoe technology. And I still think now, like a day later, that's probably where it's going to go.
Are you saying tune technology, TUNE?
No, shoe. Shoe technology.
Sorry, shoe.
Yeah.
My headphones are bad, sorry.
No, it's all good. So literally springs in the shoe.
Okay.
Or maybe not necessarily what most people in their mind see like springs as Tigger bouncing around, but more like the cushioning material in the shoe, something in the material that allows the athlete to lose less energy when they land. And that's something since 2007 I've been thinking would be the next advance, because back then we had this big discussion around Oscar Pistorius competing in the able-bodied Olympics. And he was running, as you might recall, on these carbon fiber blades. And the testing that was done in 2008 or so showed that those blades lost very little energy when they landed. And that's because they're made of carbon fiber, and so they're extremely stiff. So they don't lose the same energy. Think of a golf ball bouncing on a hard surface as opposed to a squash ball or something like that. So the idea that shoe technology could incorporate that same concept was never that science fiction-like to me. So I wouldn't be surprised if this technology already exists, and all that's required is that it needs a little bit of improvements and refining. Because physiologically speaking, either downhill running or shoes could I'm not going to say easily, but quite conceivably reduce the cost of running enough for the 2-hour marathon to be possible. In theory. In reality, it's different, right? Like, you can come up with all these theoretical models and say it's going to work, and it doesn't. But in theory, shoes and downhill could do the job.
Okay. Is there, this kind of goes into the whole, Speedo swimsuit controversy.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's going to be a point where, you see these shoes and, that creates too much of a form advantage? Yes. Is there going to be a fine line?
extremely fine. I mean, I don't even know that you can draw that line. Like, say for instance, you've mentioned the Speedo swimsuit. That was 2008. And the reality back then is that if you weren't swimming in that suit, you weren't winning medals. It was that effective for performance. But think about other sports, like tennis. If you look at tennis players from the 1980s, Bjorn Borg, John McEnroe, Jimmy Connors playing with wooden tennis rackets, those guys were playing a different sport almost compared to today's guys.
Yeah.
Like, it's completely different what you could do with a ball. Gymnastics, like you watch Simone Biles at the Olympics in 2016, and she's doing things that even 20 years ago, never mind 40, would have been impossible. And the only reason they're possible now is because the floor and the beam and the vault and all these pieces of equipment have changed to allow it to be possible. So sport and technological advancements are kind of synonymous. They go hand in hand. So part of me looks at this and says, well, so what if the shoe is worth 3.5%, 4%? Maybe that's fine, because as long as all the athletes have it, then it doesn't matter. So then, if I come back to the tennis example, if you had Rafael Nadal playing with a carbon fiber graphite composite tennis racket against Roger Federer playing with a wooden one, that's a problem, right? But because they've got the same thing, it's no longer an issue. So maybe trying to stand in the way of technology is a little bit old-fashioned and purist of me. But I do think running is one sport where I would like to be able to see athletes competing against athletes without one having a 2%, 3%, 4% advantage as a result of springs in their shoes, you know. So yeah, we're gonna if it happens for this reason, we are heading for an ethical discussion in the same way that swimming did.
Okay. I mean, do you just in general, do you think what they're doing and what the other group is doing is good for their sport? Like taking the moonshot marathon and not trying to do it organically and a big race? I
think there are elements of it that are good. I like the fact that it pushes marathon running into the mainstream media. You know, you guys cover marathon running, and I talk about it as though it's the pinnacle sport in the world.
Yeah.
But for most people, marathon running is like the thing that inconveniences the traffic once a weekend or something. You know? Like, so people don't really take notice of it. But this story will be covered in a good few mainstream newspapers and journals and so on. And I've had a few questions from journalists who will write about it, and it'll reach a larger audience. So that's never a bad thing.
Yeah.
This particular one, I think, takes itself less seriously than the other one did. Because I think it's fairly clear from what was said, both to your guys and in the press release and subsequently to other journalists, that Nike recognized that this won't be a legitimate world record. It won't be ratified as a world record, and they just want to show that it's possible under what are going to be quite a contrived set of circumstances and conditions, and then hope that it drives progression in the future. I'm a little skeptical that that'll happen. Depends on how contrived the conditions are, I suppose. Yeah. Whereas the previous attempt, the whole sub-2-hour thing, I think that one took itself a lot more seriously, and I found that to be almost offensive as a sports scientist, that you could go into these places like Kenya that are clearly the leaders of world running, and you could go in there and say, we're going to help you through our clever sports science to be 3 minutes faster. I found that quite arrogant and ultimately destructive, because I think when you overpromise things for sports science, it ends up leaving sports science looking like it underdelivers. So I had a few issues with that particular campaign, because to go in there and say we're going to change your training and your diet and your psychological approach, and that's going to make the difference, to me was borderline offensive. Whereas this one, I mean, no one knows how they're going to do it, but I think it's not right to say it takes itself less seriously, but I think they recognize their own their moonshot is clearly a moonshot. The other one was trying to be legitimate, and I found that more difficult or less palatable, you know.
And so I'm wondering, like, we're jumping to the dangers of hypotheticals here, so sorry, but hypothetically, if they did it and it was because of, like, springs in the shoe or a downhill course or something like that. In some ways, do you think that damages the sport? Because then when a world record is broken in a major race, there's like that asterisk. Even though it wasn't a legitimate record, it's like, you have a new official world record, but Nike's already broken the 2 hour. For the general public, is that damaging or have some sort of mixed message?
People within our sport won't be affected by that because they'll know the difference. So, if you think back when they ran 2:03 and 4 seconds or something, it was in Boston.
Yeah.
People within the sport were able to quite easily say, okay, that's really interesting, but we know Boston is not a record-eligible course.
Yeah.
We know why it happened. Now let's move on. We're going to run Berlin in a few months' time, and that's going to be the legitimate performance for the year. It was outside of the sport that you suddenly had all these people saying, like, wow, 2:03:04, that's the new world record. So I think there's going to be an issue around that. I don't think serious running people will be confused by the fact that, let's say this happens, and I must say I'm highly skeptical, but let's say they get it right, and someone runs 1:59:52 or whatever it is next year. Then Berlin will be won in, let's say, 2:02:45. It's a new world record. I don't think running people will say, oh, that 2:02:45 is a cheapened performance. I think they'll actually recognize that the 1:59 is the illegitimate, cheaper performance, But the media don't, not the media, the general public who don't follow the sport, they'll be the ones who are a little bit flummoxed by it. So I think in that regard it does damage it a little bit. The other thing about it is I think there's an ethical, moral issue here where the sport almost has become, I haven't quite figured out in my own head how to phrase this, but it's become a laboratory experiment where the athletes are effectively nameless, faceless pawns in a pursuit of a performance.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's healthy in the longer term. This seems to me to be more about, let's show off how good our science is, let's show how good our product is and our technology, and to me marathon running is about the athlete, not the support teams, although of course that matters, but I think it's overemphasized by these types of campaigns.
I mean, you did say on Twitter, treating it as or I should ask, are you treating this more as just like a cool science experiment?
Yeah, the Nike one, I think so. Because they're gonna have to do something unusual to get it done this quickly. I mean, when that initial sub-2 hour thing was announced in 2014, it was shortly after the current world record was set.
Yeah.
Even then, they were talking about doing it in 5 years. And I mean, it took... we're in an unprecedented time of world record breaking at the moment in the marathon. Yeah. I think since 2007, it's dropping more steeply than it had done since the sport was amateur. So one can understand why there's excitement. But those next 2 minutes and 58 seconds that are required, even at the unprecedented rate, it's going to take us decades to get to 2 hours. So the excitement was always a little bit premature, in my opinion. So when that initial campaign was announced, I thought, this is a little bit gimmicky. It's more about marketing and securing funds for research and so on. But it took itself so seriously that I found it, as I said earlier, a little bit offensive. Whereas this Nike thing, they're saying 6 months from now it's going to be done. Within 6 months it's going to be done. And the only way it's going to be done is if they find some outrageous loophole that they can try and exploit. Maybe they're going to put 50 pacemakers at the front and they're going to give this guy unprecedented drafting, plus the shoes, plus the perfect conditions, plus access to... You see, all those other little things to me are marginal. They're so small in terms of what they'll add to the performance. The biggest gains will be from product and course. And yeah, so in that regard, it's a cool scientific experiment. It's a thought experiment that might actually come true, which is always cool because we can have all these hypothetical discussions around what happens when you make an elite athlete run downhill for 42 kilometers. That's cool. Well, maybe we'll see it. What happens when we put springs in shoes? What can a really, really elite athlete do? So the opportunity to see, especially Kipchoge, who's without doubt the best in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
The opportunity to see him added to a set of gimmicky, quirky ideas, it's cool. I'm not going to deny that, but I would prefer not to see it happen if that contradiction can exist, you know?
Is that because, like, you know, it's not pure, and you'd almost rather it be a Roger Bannister moment?
Yeah, and I'd rather see Kipchoge racing in London in a legitimate marathon where the conditions are standardized and we know that the equipment is as standardized as is possible. To me, that's the fundamental value of marathon running, is to see those competitions less than these contrived events. So a lot depends on how contrived this is going to be. You know, people have said that when Bannister was trying to get the 4-minute mile, he used pace setters in a way that offended a lot of people at the time. Remember, they used to have guys setting the pace and then not dropping out, but they weren't in the race to compete. And back then, a lot of people were like, "Oh, this is against the moral code of the sport." So we got to be prepared to accept a little bit of not immorality, but bending of the code in order to see these breakthroughs happen. So I'm not against that, but it just depends for me how contrived they're going to go about doing this, you know. And they haven't told us much, you know. Even in your article where you got unprecedented access, no one knows exactly what's on the cards and how it's going to happen. So that in a way is, I guess, a marketing coup, because they're leaving it to our imagination. And so, for example, I can talk about a 3.5% reduction in oxygen cost and downhill at 1% and the shoes at 3.5. You know, it's a cool discussion, but yeah, I'd rather just let them race and see what the limits of human performance are rather than technological ones.
Well, great. Those are all my questions. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I mean, I suppose the other thing that enters into this, and Nike did a really weak job of explaining it, is that when you create this incentive to get better and faster and so on, doping is going to come into it, you know?
Yeah.
So they're telling us that they've been working on this for 2 years, and then when asked the question around doping and is it going to be independently verified, they say, no, we're going to consider it. Well, you've been doing it for 2 years in secret already, so why would we believe that you're going to be transparent for the next 6 months, you know? And it's the same for the previous sub-2. There are big question marks around running, as you know. Even that current world record, I would say, there are lots of people who are looking at that and saying, you know, the nature of sport these days, the way that the testing has been exposed as being inadequate, can we believe what's coming out of these countries as performances? I'd say the answer is, in general, no. And now suddenly you want to drive them to run 3% and 3 minutes faster, and you're going to say that that's all going to be done above board. So that's another ethical issue, is that when you create these incentives to get faster and faster and faster, unless you're willing to put the handbrake on through anti-doping, you're just begging for the same problem that we've created in the last 20 years in sport, you know? So, I don't know how they're going to deal with that. I mean, I saw an interview the other day with someone from the other 2R project in which he basically said that they were going to identify athletes based on their genes, and then they were going to manipulate those genes to increase the gene expression of the endurance ones and reduce the ones that are potentially inhibitive. I mean, he literally said in the interview that they would consider gene doping. Now, I think that's a little bit science fiction-y at the moment.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, they're talking like this, and that makes me very nervous.
I mean, in case, like, obviously these athletes, I mean, this is a whole other discussion of how effective the testing has been done, but they have been tested over the previous 2 years. To you, is that, of course, not enough, if that's Nike's explanation?
Yeah, I'd ask when they were tested, because if you go and run London or Berlin, of course you're going to be tested because you've won it. Mm-hmm. But we know when doping makes a difference. It's not at the race. These guys are not taking the drug 2 days before and then riding the wave of EPO in the race. They're doing it 3 months, 2 months out. And that's when they're training in isolation. And we know that in Kenya and Ethiopia, the testing is so inadequate at the actual training locations. And that for me is the question mark, is what's happening. Like, so for instance, what's happening right now in advance of an attempt that might happen in March, April next year. That's where we need to know. They can test these guys for a week before and a week after, and they'll find nothing. But they needed to be testing them right now. And that's, we've seen that in every sport. I'm not singling out Kenya and Ethiopia, and I wouldn't want to single out endurance running. It's the same thing as in cycling, where they all disappear into places where the testing's more difficult. It's the same thing for, one would argue, Jamaican sprinting ahead of the Olympics. Is how effective is the testing when it really matters in training? And that to me is a big question mark. And as I say, that's with the status quo. Now you throw in $1 million bonuses and historical barrier-breaking incentives, and all of a sudden the incentive to cheat is enormously high. Plus, let's not forget that, you know, doping was a sports science contribution to performance. Before sports science was involved in the day-to-day prep of athletes, doping was not really on the radar, and the early advances in performance through sports science were doping ones. So it does make me nervous, and I'm not saying that to level an accusation against anyone, but if you're not, in the current climate, if you're not showing that you are absolutely serious about stopping that, there's enough skepticism that what you produce at the end can't be trusted.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's going to be an interesting few months, but yeah. Thank you so much for talking, and I'll be in touch. If we decide to print this and kind of what our coverage plans are, or anything.
Just you know what the last thing is, just to say, like we're talking all these hypotheticals about can it be done and so on. And theoretically, a downhill course for 42Ks, a tailwind, shoe technology with springs that reduce the cost by 3.5%. Yes, they'll all do it. I still think it'll fail. I think 3 minutes is too much. You're still asking these guys to run basically their best half marathon twice without a break.
Yeah,
it's too big. It's too big. Like if they currently in Berlin, for instance, if they went out in the first half 30 seconds too fast, the record would be gone. So we're talking such fine margins that like 1 second a kilometer is too fast.
Yeah.
If you increase the pace by 1 second a k. So now we're talking almost 3 seconds a kilometer. In fact, more. It's 4 seconds a kilometer, 5 seconds a kilometer. It's too big. And so even bending the rules, unless it's outrageously bent, wouldn't do it. So I would expect the attempt to fail, but it might attract good publicity along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right. Well, I'll let you get back to the beach.
Thank you. Yeah, cheers. Appreciate it.
All right.
I look forward to seeing what else you find out.
Excellent.
Cool.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks, kid. You too.
Bye.
Ciao.